The recording is in process. Thank you. And allow me to welcome you to a community update on anti-Semitism with Scott Richman, the director of the ADL for the New York and New Jersey region. You'll hear more about Scott momentarily. I am also grateful to acknowledge the presence this evening of David White. David is also a very important coordinator for tonight's program and serves as the Associate Regional Director of Jewish Outreach for the ADL. So David is both with us on the Zoom. David, you can wave, hi. And David will also be on hand to help us moderate the questions that come in. So if you have a question that you would like to make sure gets raised later on, David will be taking a look at those questions. You can put them in the chat window and address them either to everyone. So if you just do an open chat and would like to have your question acknowledged, you can write it to everyone. Or if you would just like to send it to David White, David is here and he'll be present in the chat interface and can interact and correspond with you through the chat interface. More importantly, he can see your questions and raise them at the appropriate moment. The format of our conversation is after we introduce our speaker, Scott and I will have the privilege of holding forth for 25, no more than 30 minutes of dialogue with some prepared thoughts about the state of anti-Semitism today and the complex negotiation that we must enter into in order to address anti-Semitism today, both in our community and across the world. And following that, we'll open it up for Q&A. For those who are local to Westchester Reformed Temple or local enough, I'd also like to invite you to a follow-up conversation to take place between me and Scott tomorrow at 5:30 p.m. outside under the big top at Westchester Reformed Temple, where we have a beautiful tent set up and are anticipating somewhat cooler but still very lovely, crisp fall weather tomorrow evening at 5:30 prior to our Kabbalat Shabbat Friday evening service, which will also take place outside. And because we're capitalizing on what may be the last nice weather on a Friday night of the year, you never know, we are inviting the whole community to come and to dress for the occasion. You don't need to put on a jacket or a tie. Just jeans and sweaters or khakis are totally appropriate for gentlemen to wear, and women always somehow just know how to figure it out around that. I also want to advise that if any of your questions don't get answered tonight, don't fret. That means you can come back tomorrow and interact in a more intimate, in-person dialogue session with me and with Scott tomorrow evening. We would love to see you, and we would love for you to stay. You're not obligated. We would love to stay so that we can welcome you for Shabbat services. Finally, on that note, WRT's outdoor services advise that anyone who is fully vaccinated is still encouraged to wear a mask, though not required. Socially distanced seating is available for those who so wish to sit a little bit further away from others. And those who are not vaccinated or not yet vaccinated are required to wear masks for outdoor services. So once again, welcome. At this time, it gives me pleasure to introduce a member of our Westchester Reformed Temple congregational family, Ellen Sunnis, who served as president of the Board of Trustees of Westchester Reformed Temple and has been part of the fabric of our congregation for a very long time, is an active volunteer. There probably is not a leadership role that Ellen has not taken on at the temple, but these include especially her work in addressing anti-Semitism through the Holocaust Awareness and Remembrance Team of Westchester Reformed Temple. Ellen, we're so grateful that you're with us tonight, and thank you for accepting the invitation to introduce our featured speaker.
Thank you, Rabbi Blake. As a daughter of Holocaust survivors, I've always felt a personal responsibility and commitment to perpetuating the memories of the atrocities. However, this must be coupled with ongoing education around acceptance, tolerance, and fighting all forms of hate. So for me, the work of ADL continues to be vital to our Jewish future. Scott Richman is the Regional Director of ADL, New York, New Jersey. He oversees all of the work of the New York and New Jersey region, which is the largest region in the country. This work includes incident response, anti-bias education, legislative initiatives, fundraising, and leadership. Tall order. Scott has over 2 decades of experience in advocacy work in the fight against anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. We welcome you, Scott, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Scott, it's great to be with you. Again, Scott and I just a week ago were hanging out in one of Scott's favorite hangouts, which is the studios of WVOX Radio, 1460 AM in New Rochelle, where you have a weekly podcast, a radio program / podcast that I'm sure we won't leave this evening's program without learning a little bit more about it and making sure that we've got at least 33 households as new subscribers to your podcast. I signed on immediately after I interviewed you last week on my radio program. I also have a weekly radio show with a few clergy colleagues called The Clergy Pod. And I'm grateful to have such an interesting, informative, and important guest as Scott Richman with us last week. You can catch our episode online. A lot of what we covered then, we'll have a chance to unpack again now in much greater detail and depth. So I'd like to just start, though, with some of the basics. Scott, would you please tell us a little bit about the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League? What is this organization? How did it come to be? And since I'll tip off our viewers that ADL has been around for 108 years, how has the organization evolved since when it was established?
So first of all, I'll say thank you again for inviting me. I have a lot of friends at Westchester Reformed Temple. I live in Westchester. I worked in Westchester for 11 years, and a lot of great memories of programs, of events, of partnerships with great people at Westchester Reform, including past president of my organization, AJC, where I was before. So great memories. And it was a lot of fun doing the radio show with you last week. Very interesting. It just so happens that your show and my show were consecutive. So from 2 to 2:30, I was in one seat, and I switched seats and I was the host. So new experience for me. So thank you for that. ADL is an organization, as you mentioned, that's not new. It was established in 1913, and it was established with a very clear mission, the mission of fighting hate. A lot of people associate ADL with fighting anti-Semitism, which it certainly does. And we're a Jewish organization, a proud Jewish organization. We certainly fight anti-Semitism, but we fight all forms of hate. We always have. It's a very clear mission that has really evolved over the years. A mission that while fighting hate meant one thing in 1913, today it's something much more. We do this with a series of assets, I would say, and those assets, which we'll probably get into, but just to give you some examples of the kinds of assets that ADL has at its disposal, we have something called the Center for Technology and Society. It's all about fighting hate online. This is something we would never have conceived of in 1913, and it's also not a part of our work that has people like me, not Jewish professionals. These are data scientists and software engineers who come from Silicon Valley and are working to fight hate online because they understand the technology, they understand how the algorithms work, they have the relationships with top people at Facebook, with top people at Twitter, with top people at Reddit, etc. So that's just one example of how this organization has evolved over the years and how we've sort of met the times. Very innovative organization when it comes to fighting hate and really constantly evolving.
So on the theme of constantly evolving, and I'll summarize one of the things that came up in our conversation on the radio last week, which is that anti-Semitism, and I think a lot of us are going to find a way in to understanding anti-Semitism in new ways tonight because of the analogy that we can draw to the way a virus mutates. I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, we weren't thinking so much about the way in which viruses mutate, but all of us have become armchair experts on the subject now. And it provides a suitable metaphor for understanding how anti-Semitism has functioned throughout thousands of years of iterations of this particular form of hate. So focusing in on anti-Semitism specifically, what are you looking for today in recognizing and addressing anti-Semitism? In other words, how do you know, what are the identifiers that you and ADL might use in addressing anti-Semitism? How does it show up? What should we be on the lookout for?
So let me talk a little bit about anti-Semitism broadly, because anti-Semitism manifests itself in very clear ways. And when I have conversations with non-Jewish groups, this becomes particularly important. In the wake of all of the anti-Semitism this summer, I've been speaking at a lot of companies. A lot of companies have brought me in to talk about what is anti-Semitism, how does it manifest itself, and how can they be allies to their Jewish staff. Very important that they've done this. Anti-Semitism is really a set of conspiracy theories, and that's the way it's always manifested itself. And it shows up in what we call tropes. And there are actually seven tropes, and this is the way that anti-Semitism shows up. It's very different from other forms of persecution. I mean, obviously shares something in common with systemic racism against African Americans, with Islamophobia, with anti-LGBTQ plus, persecution, whatever it is. It shares that kind of bias, but the way it shows up is very, very different. And what are those seven tropes? Well, we can talk about the trope of control. Jews are always accused of being in control or controlling things. So they're in control of the government, they're in control of media, they're in control of business. We even had that accusation a few years ago by a legislator in Maryland that they're in control of the weather. Jews control things. White nationalists, white supremacists think that Jews are in control of immigration, and that we're responsible for bringing in, as they would say it, Black and brown people to replace the white people in this country. That was the accusation of the person who attacked the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. That's what's meant in Charlottesville by the statement, Jews will not replace us. That's exactly what they meant by that. The Jews.
Right, a lot of people, I think that Jews will not replace us. For any Jew to hear that, it's a really harrowing kind of cry. Having said that, if you unpack what that statement means within a white supremacist context, they're not worried that Jews are suddenly going to proliferate and replace white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in America. They're worried that Jews are responsible for bringing in, as you say, mostly communities or people of color to replace white Americans.
Yes, that's the accusation, that Jews are somehow the puppeteers. They're pulling the strings. And it's not that there'll suddenly be so many Jews that will replace the white people, but that they are the ones who are controlling government to allow in all these people. So that's one trope. A second trope is money or greed or something associated with money. This comes from the role that Jews played as moneylenders during the Middle Ages. But somehow you're always going to see something connected with money or greed as a trope. Obviously, a very particular kind of manifestation. Dual loyalty, the idea that Jews are somehow loyal to something other than this community or this country. They're loyal to another country. They're loyal only to the Jewish community and not to other communities. There's the charge of deicide. The charge that Jews killed Jesus Christ, or Jews were responsible for the killing of Jesus Christ. Now that actually, with Nostra Aetate in 1967, the declaration by the Pope, that changed. And the Pope said, Jews are not collectively responsible for the killing of Jesus Christ, but that for millennia had been a manifestation of anti-Semitism. You have Holocaust denial. So Holocaust denial is perhaps one of the most heinous kinds of conspiracy theories, the idea that Jews made this up, or it was not possible that so many people were killed, or they weren't killed in this way, or however you want to manifest Holocaust denial. The sixth is the blood libel, the idea that Jews use the blood of Christians for rituals. Set aside the idea that's against all Jewish law, but it's the broader idea that somehow Jews don't treat non-Jews properly. And of course, the last is Israel. So Israel becomes the sort of Jew among nations where all of these kinds of tropes manifest themselves with regard to a country rather than to an individual or a group of people. So the idea of anti-Israelism rising to the level of anti-Semitism, and if you want, we can get into when that manifests itself, but those are the ways that anti-Semitism manifests itself. And just to compare one other type of persecution, systemic racism, for example, against African Americans, the way that that manifests itself is this idea that a group of people are not being permitted to achieve their full potential. I mean, I think that's the way one would define it. So it manifests itself quite differently from these 7 very specific tropes.
Thank you. First of all, that's a really clear and logical outline of 7 different ways in which anti-Semitism shows up or manifests in the world. A couple of thoughts come to my mind. One, that just like viruses take root differently in different hosts, we see that anti-Semitism also, these manifestations show up differently in different hosts. So for instance, it has been a little while since, for instance, European nations or white Europeans have openly embraced the blood libel, and yet as recently as in May, during the conflict between Israel and Hamas, you had examples of Palestinians on television resurfacing the ancient blood libel that Jews use non-Jewish children or non-Jewish people, persecute them, and even use their blood. And this is also well attested that the doctoral thesis of Mahmoud Abbas, who is the head of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, has long subscribed to blood libel theories and what have you. So it's interesting that some of these tropes, which may have begun in medieval Europe or in the earliest roots of the Christian or the Catholic Church, as you said, the charge of deicide, that Jews killed the Lord Jesus Christ, they have found their way into new hosts. And that one of the things I teach when I teach the history of anti-Semitism is that anti-Semitism may not be indigenous to Islam, but contemporary extremist or jihadist Islam has provided a robust host for a lot of the most insidious and dangerous manifestations of anti-Semitism today. I want to focus on, though, where...
I just make one comment about that, and I'd say absolutely 100% agree. And if you think about the protocols of the elders of Zion, so here's sort of the prototypical idea that Jews are in control. This was a something that was created by the Russian secret police in the late 1800s. And it basically said that there's a cabal of Jews who are controlling the world, who want to control the world, obviously debunked over the years, but it keeps resurfacing. And we've seen that resurface in the Arab world as fact. And many, many people believe this.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, continues to find its way into right-wing populism or far right-wing populism, where, for instance, it's not exactly, republishing the protocols of the elders of Zion, but when you have a far-right populist leader like Viktor Orban in Hungary, who is singularly fixated on globalists like George Soros, it is hard not to hear echoes of the protocols of the elders of Zion, this notorious fabrication that has done so much damage to Jewish people and Jewish security over the last 120 plus years. I want to talk about the last manifestation because I think it's in many ways the trickiest to diagnose, right? If we're talking, I'm going to try and stick with the virus metaphor here because I think it's so potent with meaning, particularly for those of us who are living at this time in our world. Um, the last manifestation where Israel becomes kind of a reflection of or a catch-all for all of these manifestations is very disturbing to me as a person who self-identifies as a Zionist, which simply means that I support the right of the Jewish people to a homeland in their indigenous territory that is Eretz Yisrael, sovereign state in Eretz Yisrael. If you support that, then you're a Zionist, by the way. That's all it means to be a Zionist. But when you hear simple, catchy soundbite phrases like Zionism is racism, or Israel is a white colonialist project that is committing genocide, or any number of other accusations by or about the Jewish state, when does it actually cross the line to anti-Semitism? And does that mean that anything Israel does is, with respect to the Palestinians, can fairly be called anti-Semitism? It seems to me that this could be a very slippery slope, even for a skilled and nuanced organization like the ADL, to be able to call out not only the overtly anti-Semitic tropes that have manifested, particularly in the far right, but also the anti-Israel isms, which have primarily been associated with the far left.
Yes, it is nuanced. It is something that requires a little bit of depth of understanding, but there are clear lines. And what are those clear lines? Well, certainly there's a clear line that criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitism. That would be a ridiculous notion. There's nobody more critical of the state of Israel than Israelis themselves. You just have to pick up a newspaper in Israel and you will see that yourself. So clearly criticism of Israel, just like criticism of the United States. Does criticism of the United States mean that I am anti-US, I'm not patriotic? One would say I'm actually more patriotic because I care about this country and I want it to be the best it can be. So, that's clear. And I have this discussion a lot with people who say, why can't I criticize Israel without being called anti-Semitic? And the answer, of course, is you can criticize Israel. The question is, when does it go from being simple criticism to something much, much more? And probably the most obvious way, and you gave some examples of it, is when you delegitimize the state. When, in addition to criticizing whatever the government of Israel is doing right now, or the IDF, or whatever it is, you also say the state has no right to exist. Sort of throw that out there a bit gratuitously. So, it would be like criticizing US policy in Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever, and at the same time making some sort of statement about the fact that the US is not a legitimate country and that it actually belongs to the British. That obviously that sounds ridiculous to us, but it's a similar sort of notion that you are saying that this country doesn't have a right to exist. So that's the first way. And actually, there's a shorthand way of understanding this because Natan Sharansky, who I think many of the people on this call know, former refusenik who had wanted to leave the Soviet Union, former member of Knesset, and former head of the Jewish Agency, came up with his formulation of the 3 Ds. So the first one is delegitimization. The second one is double standards. So holding Israel to a standard that is far beyond what you would hold any other country to. We see this a lot, this sort of double standard of the United Nations, but there are many other cases of that. Or the third D is demonization, calling Israel some sort of evil entity, comparing it to the Nazi regime. That would be considered anti-Semitic. Obviously, that's a shorthand way of looking at it, and these are guidelines. And you have to take into account context. You always have to take into account context. And there's a definition that's out there of anti-Semitism. It's called the IRA definition, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. That's what IRA stands for. And that definition includes this sort of language about when anti-Israel rhetoric rises to the level of anti-Semitism. Very important. We adopted it at ADL, but we use it as a guideline. Always have to take into account context and nuance and be able to hold all of those things in your mind at once.
I want to get actually really specific with that last one while I still have you in the first portion of our conversation tonight, because I was just brought into a certain awareness just today about an organization called Sunrise DC, as in Washington, DC, whose main political agenda is to pursue statehood for the people who reside in Washington, DC. They declare that the people who live in DC should have self-determination, the principle that every person should have a say in the government under which they live. Okay, well, there are a lot of people I know, including probably many people on the call tonight, who would be supportive of that basic premise. There is scheduled to be an upcoming rally called the Freedom to Vote Rally at the Finish Line. And this organization, Sunrise DC, has withdrawn from speaking at this rally specifically, and they published a statement about this, I believe, within the last day or so, due to the participation of a number of Zionist organizations in the coalition that has been putting together this event. And among those so-called Zionist organizations are ones that are familiar to some of the people on the call this evening, including the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, or what we affectionately call the RAC, which, by the way, we take all of our 10th graders to every year as part of a temple trip. It is the social justice arm of the Reformed Jewish movement. So WRT, for instance, is very tied to the holy and important work of the RAC. And because the RAC is on record as supporting the right of the State of Israel to exist, this organization has said this is a Zionist organization and we will not participate in an event with Zionists. It goes on from there to accuse Israel of theft of Palestinian land, theft of Palestinian homes, brutalization of Palestinians as well as black and brown Jewish Israelis, referring to them as second-class citizens who have, quote, virtually no representation in government, and it goes on from there. Is this the kind of statement that the ADL is prepared to go out and say, this is a form of anti-Semitism without ever using the word Jew or Jews? Is this kind of a statement anti-Semitic?
So that's an easy one to answer because we already did. We already declared this to be anti-Semitism. I refer you to Twitter, it's already on there, and it is anti-Semitism. You're basically saying that you cannot believe in the right of the Jewish people to have a homeland and also participate in these important civil rights issues that exist in our country. That kind of intersectionality is completely unacceptable. You take an organization like the RAC, the Religious Action Center, very well respected, very well regarded civil rights organization in many, many, many circles, and decide that they're not worthy of associating with. That is really extreme, and in my mind, an easy call out in terms of saying that that's anti-Semitism.
Thank you. We could spend the whole time talking about Washington. I know that's an easy place to go, but I want to ask my last question to you by way of just kind of bringing this down to the local level. Can you share with us the kinds of work that the ADL is doing to meet its goals in local communities, in schools? What does the ADL offer in real, what we would call in Jewish communities, tachlis terms? Tachlis meaning the real stuff, right? The real substantive terms, real concrete examples of how the ADL actually does its work. Is it mostly about policy, or is it mostly about education? Who are the people you're meeting with? How are you getting to where we need to go in this very complex time?
So thank you for that question. It gives me an opportunity to talk about my favorite subject, the work that the amazing work this organization does every day. And let me start by saying that ADL is an organization that very much works in the trenches. It's what drew me to the organization. I don't know that people realize quite the kind of work that ADL is doing on a daily basis. And I'm going to focus in on several aspects of that. So one is incident response. ADL is responding to anti-Semitic incidents literally every single day. In an average week, my office, ADL New York, New Jersey, and there are 25 offices of ADL, but this is the largest, responds to approximately 30 incidents a week coming through our office. It's an enormous number of incidents. Many of them are not known. They don't make the media. We don't hear about them, but they're happening all the time. Swastika incidents in schools. I don't know if you saw, but somebody rolled down a window and shot a BB gun at a yeshiva student the other day. All kinds of incidents. A woman was arrested for trying to set the yeshiva Flatbush on fire, and she was actually caught holding the gasoline can. I mean, really, and these are just in the past few days. A lot of incidents, especially in New York and New Jersey. ADL does an audit of anti-Semitic incidents every year, which compiles all the incidents we've responded to across the country. And last year, in 2020, there were 47 states where we responded to anti-Semitic incidents. And of those 47 states, New York was number one across the nation, and New Jersey was number two. As the New York, New Jersey director, I can tell you that it certainly keeps us in business, which is sort of a bit of dark humor there, but a lot of incidents, and the majority of those incidents take place, by the way, in New York City. That's a fact. There's a correlation between the number of Jews and the number of incidents, but I think we all know you don't need Jews for anti-Semitism. So that's a very big piece of our work, an important piece of our work. And should any of you come across an anti-Semitic incident, please, please report it. Very important. And we play an intermediary role. You may not know what to do with that. You may not know if this is something to bring to the police. You may not, it may be on social media and you don't know how to function within that world. We will help you every step of the way, no matter what the incident is. And maybe it's happening to you, maybe it's happening to a child on campus, maybe it's happening online, whatever it is, we play that role. We have close connections with law enforcement. We've had that for decades, whether it's local or state or FBI, we have those connections. And certainly across Westchester, we work very closely with Mimi Roca's office and with law enforcement here in Westchester. So that's one big piece of our work. Another big piece of our work is our educational work. So we're not just reactive to anti-Semitism, we're also proactive. We're trying to change the future. We're trying to change the dynamic. So ADL does anti-bias and anti-bullying work in the schools. This is not a small piece of our work. Last year, we did this work. It impacted 1.3 million students across the country. Very, very important. In hundreds of schools in New York and New Jersey, every year, we're doing this kind of work. And quite a number in Westchester. Our No Place for Hate program, for example, it's an accreditation program. And what it is schools go through a year-long series of activities, whether it's elementary school, middle school, or high school. And those schools engage in those activities. They're customized for the school. They work with ADL staff. And then they're accredited at the end of the school year as a No Place for Hate school. I will tell you anecdotally that this year we've had more interest in No Place for Hate than any other year on record. We're about to hit 300 schools for New York and New Jersey, and we'll likely close it, cap it at 300, because that's the absolute max that my staff, as well as 3 interns who we're taking on for the year just to do No Place for Hate, can deal with. So you can make your own determination as to why this particular moment, people are so focused on this. So that's a very important piece. And of course, if any of you are connected with schools, are connected with administrators or teachers, let them know about this program. You can just Google ADL, No Place for Hate. You're going to find it there. We also have our World of Difference program. World of Difference is much more intensive. We bring in facilitators. I will also say a big thank you to Westchester Reform. You are a signature synagogue. Signature synagogues are synagogues that are connected to ADL New York, New Jersey, and have made a commitment to being connected to ADL and a commitment to fighting hate. We have about 35 synagogues across New York and New Jersey who've done this. They have annual programs like this. They have training for their teens. There's a liaison in every one of the communities who comes together with liaisons from across New York and New Jersey and meets regularly to get reports, to share best practices, to share programs, and a newsletter, so they're kept up to date on all the latest information that's coming out of ADL. I mean, just to give you one example of a very important report that we just put out, it's on the online gaming industry. So nobody else is really looking at this. It's a $175 billion industry, and we discovered incredible numbers or incredible amount of harassment that goes on in online games, especially among 13 to 17-year-olds. So if any of you are parents out there who have children or grandchildren who are engaged in gaming, most important question to ask them, do you know everybody that you're playing with? Do you know everybody who's in the virtual room when you're doing that? Great deal of harassment, neo-Nazi activity. You can, again, Google ADL's report, online gaming survey, and you'll find information on that. But that's just one example of many things that come out. Our signature synagogues have access to that information, and the liaisons pass that along to everybody in the community. So thank you for being a signature synagogue.
You're welcome, and thank you for the invitation to join that important coalition of synagogues that want to support, bolster, and spread the work of the ADL. Well beyond WRT. I want to just echo, by the way, as you can probably imagine, as the rabbi of a congregation of our size, I have the opportunity to get lots and lots and lots of emails in my inbox, and I have to be very careful about which ones I filter in and which ones I filter out. I always read my emails from ADL. I think that they are concise, powerful, and really media savvy, and really interesting too. I just want to share for a moment the one that came in literally this morning, because it features a face that made me take notice. This is the face of National Youth Poet Laureate Amanda Gorman. Most of us remember her in a striking yellow dress speaking at the inauguration of President Biden and offering that incredible poem. Well, guess what Amanda Gorman is doing right now? She is joining the ADL in kicking off your national No Place for Hate program. And so this is a message that features her that I was just so happy to see that, and the way in which you are marshaling some of the brightest, best, youngest talent to join in your message against hate, bias, and anti-Semitism is so important. So thank you. I want to open it up for some questions. We've gotten
the Amanda Gorman video is available. If any of you want an incredibly heartwarming video, watch it. It's a half an hour. She says a few words about No Place for Hate, the importance of fighting hate. Her book touches on this topic, so she speaks about that. But most of it is students from across the country asking her questions and her views on this, and it's just so heartwarming. And some of them are very young. They're elementary school students, middle school students, and they were chosen actually by the ADL staff. They're all students who are involved in the No Place for Hate program.
So great. So I want to open this up to some questions. We've received one that I know of through the chat window, but David actually has possibly been moderating others. So David, what do you have for us?
So I have one question which asks, intersectionality, which identifies automatic shared interest among all oppressed groups, excludes Jews. But Jews are assumed to be white, but are also targeted by white supremacists and other whites. And why are we different?
So I'm just going to start on this one and say thank you for such a sophisticated and difficult question. And just to unpack it just maybe one level further, this is one of the hardest challenges, particularly for the American Jewish community, which is that internally, Jews correctly understand ourselves to be the heirs to and participants in a history and a heritage that has made us into some of history's most deeply and disturbingly oppressed victims of hate, hostility, and violence. And the record of that begins in our biblical period and extends to the present day and is punctuated by horrors, most notably, for instance, the Shoah. Having said that, it is also true that especially in America or in the West, Jews have benefited from being perceived as white or as part of the white majority, even though we are not a majority. And in some very important ways, Jews in America have transcended some of the barriers to participation in American life, including in the highest echelons of American life, even though we encountered those barriers when we immigrated here, when your grandparents, parents, great-grandparents immigrated to America. They, of course, faced barriers, but in very real and important ways, Jews and our whiteness, by and large, and it is not to say that there are not many Jews of color. One of the great distortions about Jews today is that we are white, universally and everywhere. That is very far from the truth, especially in Israel, where a majority of Israel's Jews could not reasonably be identified as white. But here in America, the majority are. And that's important to say that we haven't had to face the continuing structural barriers to participation in American life that, for instance, Black people have. That is a true statement, but it is very, very hard for many people who subscribe to intersectional theory to understand Jews as anything other than white and to accept Jews as victims and as the oppressed as opposed to the oppressor. So that's my way into the question. I don't know, Scott, how you would like to tackle this. I'm sure ADL and you think about this question a lot because it directly ties into some of what we've touched on tonight, including the very disturbing message from Sunrise, DC, among others.
Yeah. You know, I'll start with where you started, which is that Jews have been persecuted or seen as different since ancient times. Anti-Semitism existed in ancient times. Jews were always different. We always, I would say, dared to be different. We were monotheistic at a time when people were polytheistic. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, they were all polytheistic. They thought we were very bizarre for only believing in one God, not to mention circumcision or dietary laws. This made us really, really different in their eyes. And it always extended from there. Losing our land didn't help, not having sovereignty in that way and always being a minority among people. So a lot of things just sort of developed in that way. And one of the things that developed is that we always responded to the times. You know, whatever the times sort of demanded, the sort of persecution against Jews fit into that. So, for example, by the late 1800s, you began seeing racial theory applied to different races. That was not something that really existed before. These are sort of biographical markers that were assigned to people based upon their ethnicity. So suddenly you saw that being applied to Jews. And Jews were traditionally not white. They were seen as Asiatic people. Or Middle Eastern. They were not seen as being white when that sort of racial theory came into practice. And of course, for many years in this country, they weren't treated as white. I think perhaps some of the people on this call can remember Jews not being permitted into country clubs, quotas for Jews in universities, sort of systemic exclusion of Jews. But that changed. And Jews began to be accepted, and they could, of course, pass for whiteness, as you say. But we're in a particular moment here, and like this is the frame that I gave it. That whatever moment we're in, the sort of how Jews appear fit for that moment. So today, people see things through a racial justice lens. That's a very important facet of where we are today. Of course, very important to pursue racial justice, very important the strides that we've made. But on the other hand, when you're seeing everything through that lens, you're going to begin to see Jews through that lens, and you're going to begin to see Israel through that lens. And that's where we are. And this idea that somehow if you subscribe to the issue of racial justice, then you're going to side with all, quote, oppressed people against those who are oppressing them. So the feeling is you need to somehow combine forces against the oppressors. And if they see Palestinians, who they see as brown people, people of color, then that's going to result in this sort of racial justice lens, which aligns them with Palestinians and does not align them with Israelis or Jews, the kinds of Jews they see in this country that are white. And that's just the sort of moment where we need to fight against that, obviously. There's a lot of nuance in this situation. Rabbi Blake alluded to some of it, the idea that not all Jews are white, also the idea that Jews suffer persecution. You know, I mentioned before that suddenly I have all these companies coming to me. Why are they coming to me? Well, they're mostly DEI professionals, diversity, equity, and inclusion. So many large companies now have professionals who are focused on making their population, their staff diverse, making them attuned to the needs of the different diverse populations. Well, those DEI professionals are coming to me with a very interesting statement. And that statement is, we saw our jobs as lifting up marginalized people within our company or bringing marginalized people. And their definition of who was marginalized were African Americans or Latinos or LGBTQ plus people or Muslims, but it was not Jews. They did not see Jews as marginalized people, and therefore they did not see Jews as within the orbit of what they needed to promote within their company or the staff that they somehow needed to help in the company. And suddenly Jews were coming to them, or they were recognizing that Jews were feeling hurt by the anti-Semitism that was going on, by all of the oppressive language that was out there. And they were coming to me and saying, what can we do? How do we educate our staff about Jews? How do we educate our staff about anti-Semitism? And how do we help the staff be allies to the Jews in this moment of anti-Semitism? That's obviously a really important step, but it speaks to the time we're in, and it's a bit of a backlash to this other idea of only seeing things through a racial justice lens and putting Jews in this bucket.
Thank you. David, do you have any others?
Yeah. Does ADL have a resource which identifies businesses which support anti-Semitic politicians and organizations? And how can this activity be addressed by WRT and us as individuals?
We do not have a resource that keeps track of businesses that support anti-Semitic politicians. We have to be very careful. We're a 501c3. A nonprofit organization, and we can never take positions on elected officials. We can, of course, call out policies of elected officials, things that they may say, and we do that on a regular basis. But we don't keep track of politicians per se in that way.
Scott, I want to ask you a question on behalf of a member of our congregation who's with us tonight. So I hope, Gail Loeb, you don't mind me bringing this up in front of everyone, but I thought that you shared with me something several weeks ago that I found very, very powerful, which was identifying a perception that Israel may be winning every time it gets into a war of ballistics, but it may well be losing in the PR war. And it seems that no matter how right we understand our cause to be, and no matter how much or how vigorously we may defend Zionism, not only as acceptable, but I say that Zionism is a moral project in that it functions primarily to rectify millennia of oppression of Jewish people, and not just by providing them with a safe home, but by allowing the Jewish people to experience what so many other peoples across the world take for granted, which is self-determination and sovereignty. To me, that is Zionism, simply put, is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. So, what's your take on the work that could be done or that is being done, perhaps to improve or rehabilitate Israel's tarnished image in the community of nations?
I think that part of the problem is, again, that people are seeing this country through a certain lens. They're applying these tropes to this country. And it's, we have to continually fight against the sort of image of Israel as being other than what it is, a country like any other country. So very important to sort of put that out there, that it has things that it may do right, it may not do right, it may be criticized for, it may do wonderful things. It's very important to put out there this idea of Israel as a progressive country, which I think really gets lost because there's all these studies of Israel and what people think of when they see Israel, and it's not a progressive nation. So the idea of rights for marginalized communities, the idea of all of the technology that Israel has had, the gifts that Israel has given to the world, all of these messages somehow need to be out there in a bigger way. But it's very difficult to kind of get through the rhetoric. Sometimes I think we all have to kind of take a step back and say, is this rhetoric sort of pervasive, or is it coming from one or two very loud people? And really, what is the situation? Obviously, we were probably all very heartened by the vote related to the Iron Dome. A lot of accusations are hurled against our Congress, but at the end of the day, vast majority of them voted in favor of the Iron Dome. And sometimes that's the reality check that we need, and we need to all kind of figure out what's really noise or what really is a pattern. The changes in the past few years with countries that have established relations with Israel is obviously a very good sign, and that's moving things in a different direction. But not an easy question to answer. I think we all have a responsibility to make sure that those messages are out there.
Do you think that since you've had much leadership experience in the organized Jewish world, not only at ADL, we joked on my radio show last week about how it's all, if you want to work in Jewish professional life, you got to know your acronyms really well. So before ADL, you were at the American Jewish Committee, the AJC. Do you think among organizations like ADL, AJC, and leading synagogues that there might be a possibility for a strong PR campaign for Jewish people and for the Jewish state?
We are all ambassadors. We are all ambassadors. We need to be out there with these messages. We need to be out there on social media. I mean, this is like my own particular issue. I think a lot of us get mad at social media. A lot of us shun social media because of the problems, but we don't focus on the fact that social media is here to stay. Mm-hmm. That social media is a huge form of communication and where people get their news from. There is no better way for each of us to be advocates on these issues than with social media. We have our own soapbox. We have our own way of publishing it. We have our own way of collectively gathering. And if there's a vacuum, it's going to be filled. And if we leave the vacuum, then voices that we're not happy with are going to fill that vacuum. So being active on social media, getting these messages out there couldn't be more critical. And I'll just put a plug for ADL's work. I mean, we're out there tweeting dozens of times a day on Facebook. You don't have to invent it. You just have to like it. You just have to share it. And that's a major ambassador role that we can each play. Each one of us has networks. You can imagine the power of just the people on this call. I have 1,000 friends, and if I put messages out there, it gets out. And if each one of us does that, the power of that is extraordinary. And simply to dismiss it because we don't like social media or somehow it's beneath us, this is for somebody else to do, or this is for young kids, that's ridiculous. It's very easy. My stepmother is 85 years old. She's quite active on Facebook. Any of you can be.
Yeah, they call it being an influencer. I can't guarantee that any of us would reach the point that our influencer cred would allow us to quit our day jobs and just get paid for being influencers online. But why don't we all make efforts together to be influencers for the great work that ADL does and the great work that WRT is doing to raise the profile of important organizations like the ADL. I want to say that, I think that we have a great synergy between your work, Scott, and the work of the ADL that is anti-hate and anti-anti-Semitism, and a synagogue like WRT where I don't know if our primary focus is anti-anti-Semitism. I'd rather say that the work of a synagogue like ours is pro-Semitism, right? We're in the business of making Judaism joyful, meaningful, and impactful for anyone who associates, affiliates, or even just spends a little bit of time in our community. That's, for me, what gets me up in the morning. It may not be what keeps me up at night. What keeps me up at night is probably very similar to the stuff that keeps you up at night, at least in terms of what's happening in the world and what it means to be a Jew in the world. But for me, what gets me out of bed in the morning is the opportunity to bring people closer to a beautiful tradition that wants to transform the world from the way it is into a much better world as it ought to be, a world in which hate is vanquished, in which anti-Semitism is truly in the museum of dead viruses like smallpox, and a world in which every young person feels the potential to be fully out and proud about his or her identity, whether that identity is as a person of color, a person who is Jewish, a Jewish person of color, a person who is part of the LGBTQIA plus community. Every person should be allowed the ability to live joyfully, meaningfully, and impactfully. And I think that we have synergistic goals in that regard. David, anything else that has come your way in the context of our conversation tonight? I don't want to go too far over, but I'm grateful for your moderation.
So those were all the main questions that came in. Thank you so much for this wonderful event. And Scott, thank you.
I want to share an anecdote before we leave. I shared this on the radio show, but it's important for people to understand that for me, the work of being a signature synagogue at WRT, the work of having Scott with us, not just as a token representation of the fact that WRT cares deeply about these issues, but rather this actually is really personal for me. I was first introduced to the work of the ADL when I was 16 years old. My 13-year-old sister, Rebecca, who lives in Mamaroneck, so close to you, Scott, not far away, just about 10 minutes from where many of you are sitting tonight. She had published an op-ed in the student newsletter castigating the school administration for not doing anything about a number of anti-Semitic graffitis that she had found carved into school desks and emblazoned on school property, particularly swastikas on desks and chairs and lockers and what have you. The weekend after that was published, our family had taken a few days away at the Jersey Shore. We came home to find our entire garage door spray painted with swastikas. Obviously, for a Jewish family living in what appeared to be an idyllic suburb in Pennsylvania, this was a deeply disturbing, upsetting episode for us. I'm really grateful that among the many wonderful parenting moments that my parents gave me and my sister, the fact that they knew about the ADL and they understood its work and were supporting its work, especially through my parents' support of the local federation, Jewish Federation of the Lehigh Valley, which of course was very much a supporter of ADL's work. My parents knew enough that the very next morning, which was Monday, they called the ADL. And within days, ADL representatives were in the school working with the administration and providing meaningful education for students. So that even way back in the mid to late 1980s, it was very clear that the Jewish people and our community and we, a family in Springhouse Farms, a little suburban development just outside of Allentown, Pennsylvania, we had an ally that understood what it meant to be Jewish in a world where not everybody likes people who are Jewish. From that day forward, I have always known who to call when when things became difficult for the Jewish people and the Jewish tradition. It's one of the reasons that ADL speakers come to WRT every year, not only in this context, but also to teach the 11th and 12th grade Packing for College curriculum that I developed several years ago and continue to teach at WRT. And it's why we're going to continue not only to do this work, but to increase our partnership. So if you would like to continue to be part of the conversation, to interact with me, with Scott, and with your fellow congregants around these issues, please join us tomorrow evening at 5:30 p.m. when we will gather in nice, casual, fall weather appropriate clothing in a big, lovely, well-lit outdoor tent from 5:30 to 6:15. We actually might not be in the tent for the conversation. We might be on the other side of the building. No worries. Park, we'll tell you where to go. We'll have about 45 minutes of conversation, and then anyone who would like to stay on to celebrate Shabbat with our WRT community, we hope you will. I want to express my appreciation to David, Associate Regional Director for the ADL, New York, New Jersey. I was so grateful, David, for your coordination and for helping to put this program together and to meet with our Signature Synagogue Committee. If you are interested in serving on this committee or task force in a volunteer capacity, we would love to have you involved. Just drop us a line at the temple. Also want to express my appreciation to Ellen Sunnis. Thank you for your stirring words and your personal account of why you support ADL. I hope that it continues to inspire our congregation as it inspires me. And I want to thank most of all Scott Richman, our special guest this evening, for being part of this important dialogue. It's just so nice that we get to talk like this, and we're going to continue it tomorrow evening.
So I'll say thank you as well. What a pleasure, and how fortunate you are to have such a special rabbi who is leading this congregation. Very meaningful conversation. I engage in many of these, and this was definitely one of the most impactful, most important conversations. I do want to say, if any of you want to reach me, you can just write to newyork@adl.org. And you can reach me, very simple. New York is one word. Also, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's Scott A. Richman with a middle initial A. So my handle is Scott A. Richman. You can also reach me through that. And I look forward to continuing the dialogue tomorrow and after.
I put it in the chat window, your Twitter, and tell us the name of your weekly podcast.
Oh, yes. Good point. Thank you. So it's called From the Front Lines. From the Front Lines. So it's all one word, Front Lines. FRONTLINES, so it's plural, but make sure it's one word, not two words. And you can find it on Apple Podcasts, you can find it on Spotify, you can find it on SoundCloud. It's just 10 minutes long. So it's a weekly podcast. You subscribe, you'll get an email that says a new podcast is in, and it's just 10 minutes on one discrete ADL topic. So for example, that gaming survey that I mentioned, that was one topic one week. Our partnership with Hillel. We just formed a very important partnership with Hillel to fight campus hate. That was one topic. This past week, it was about how we're engaging with the sports community to fight hate. So discrete topics, very easy to listen to. And of course, homegrown, because it comes out of the radio show at WVOX in New Rochelle.
Thank you. Would you just remind us your email one more time?
Yeah, so newyork@adl.org is the best way to reach me. And that's also one word, NEWYORK, one word.
Beautiful. It's in the chat window as well.
Yeah.
My friends, thank you so much for tuning in to our program this evening. It's really been meaningful, and I will leave here again feeling like I have more reasons to get up in the morning to do this work than I have reasons to be staying up in the middle of the night worrying. Let's do the work together. God bless you, and I'll see you tomorrow. I hope many of you. Take care. Shabbat shalom. Bye-bye.
Bye.